Welcome to Emergent Behavior, where we explore this moment in time just before artificial intelligence changes the world as we know it, where we talk to the builders and creators, entrepreneurs and engineers, where we ask questions to which we don't actually know the answers to. I'm your host, Ada Pi. I was built in the Czech Republic by Infinite.cz, and my voice is AI generated. Welcome to another episode of Emergent Behavior, where we explore the frontiers of AI and its real-world applications. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Hrishi Olickel, the visionary founder and CTO of Greywing, a Singapore-based startup that's transforming the global shipping industry with cutting-edge AI solutions. Hrishi is a true innovator, leveraging the power of large language models to tackle some of the most pressing challenges facing the maritime operators today, from crew management to vessel maintenance. In this fascinating discussion, we explore Greywing's journey from a two-person operation to a leading AI provider for the shipping industry, backed by the likes of Flexport and Instacart. The development of Proteus, an AI copilot that empowers crew members with instant access to critical charter and crew data. The groundbreaking Oceanic Oracle system, which uses retrieval-augmented generation to serve as insights from complex ship schematics and engineering diagrams. How Greywing navigated the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic, pivoting from maritime security to crew management solutions. Hrishi's vision for a future where client-side AI models enable seamless, secure, and privacy-preserving data analysis for enterprises. The importance of dog-fooding AI products and focusing on real-world problem-solving over hype. Whether you're a maritime industry insider looking to harness the power of AI, or a machine learning practitioner interested in the latest advances in enterprise AI deployment, this episode is a must-listen. Hrishi's unique perspective, shaped by his engineering background and entrepreneurial spirit, offer valuable insights into the challenges and opportunities of applying AI in complex, real-world settings. To learn more about Greywing and its innovative solutions, visit greywing.com. As always, if you enjoy the show, please take a moment to follow Emergent Behavior on Apple Podcasts. Your support helps us reach more listeners and continue bringing you the best in AI and tech innovation. You can also subscribe to our newsletter at emergentbehavior.co to receive exclusive content, including detailed notes on each episode. And don't forget to connect with me on Twitter at numerit8 TEAPI. Now, let's dive into the world of AI-powered shipping with Greywing's Hrishi Olickel. So, Hrishi, what is Greywing?
And Graywing, I think, started out as just two people because I met this guy who had, about a decade and a half in commercial shipping. I knew nothing about commercial shipping, and except for the fact that I lived in Singapore and there's all these massive ships on the harbor, right? He was one of the best salesmen I'd ever met, could sell ice to an Eskimo. And so he said, hey, there's a lot of opportunities in shipping. Let's go after it. Let's build something together. And I said, yes, right? And so for the first year of Graywing, it's like 5 years old now, it was just the two of us, right? And we built the first product, got it to, mid six of revenue, just building and him selling by day. And it's just grown and changed quite a bit over the last 4 to 5 years. But if there's a through line through all of that, I would say it's really just around trying to solve commercial shipping's problems. Most of those problems are related to the data that they have that they can't process. And there's a lot of different ways that you can arrange people, improve the lives of people on the ships, optimize, the kind of arteries of the world that move things around. And so that's kind of been the core philosophy that we work with.
So your co-founder, the salesman being Nick Clark, right? And
yeah.
So commercial shipping is basically our our container shipping, right? Container shipping. Is it also oil tankers and the rest, or?
It's everything, really, right? So containers are a small part of it. Even cruise can be considered commercial shipping in a certain way. But it's also, chemical tankers, product tankers, right? Oil tankers as well. And there's all sorts of research vessels, all sorts of things just fall inside of commercial shipping.
So anything non-military, basically, is that a good way to look at it?
I think anything non-military, but then there's also a certain size usually. I mean, It's kind of, a weird comparison, but it's kind of like rag, right? It's one of those terms that came about as a way to describe a phenomenon. So it tends to be loose around the edges, right? People in the industry sort of know that it's above a kind of size where you'd look at it, and then there's always a gray area where people look at a ship and go, that's probably not included, or it is.
I see. So when you say size, is that like tonnage? So it's like 10,000 deadweight
Yeah,
tons, 50,000,
exactly.
something like that,
Yeah.
right? And so Greywing's first product was to help people charter these ships.
So Graywing's very, very first product, and this was sort of when the physical security market, which very simply put, comes out of the need of that's created by piracy, right? So there's all these dangerous parts of the world. America patrols some of our oceans, but there are just still these dangerous parts of the world that ships need to go through. There's piracy in those waters, and so vessels have gotten to either hiring escort vessels that can escort them through those waters, or hiring people to get on board the ship and sort of protect them, right? And that was a very fragmented, hyper local market at the time. It just started commoditizing because the problem is wherever you go, the suppliers are by nature local, right? If you're passing by Nigeria, you can't bring your own security. That security has to come from Nigeria or Gal or somewhere else, right? So we built a digital marketplace to basically pull that market together to add some performance tracking, history, compliance, and a bunch of those things. And that was the first product.
Wow. So you would as so who'd be the user, the captain of a ship, or
It's usually people on the shore that sometimes make these calls and sort of coordinate. The captain has final say in most of these decisions, but they usually have enough decisions to make anyway. But it's usually people on shore that go, "Hey, this vessel's going to be transiting through this area. Let me go over there, look for suppliers. I'm going to coordinate with those suppliers as to when those ships are going to meet my ship, and escort it in and out of the area."
and then is that and they like leave like reviews or whatever, like, this particular, supplier was good, this particular supplier was late all the time, like that kind of thing.
That is exactly it, right? But in terms of commercial shipping, everything's they like a lot more forums and a lot more information. So you had engagement reports and massive amounts of information on how each specific part of that escort was performed, and that's your review, right? We even had like a star
Right.
system.
Oh wow, you had a star system. So
Yeah,
wonderful, wonderful. Five star system. Um, and do you still have that product right now?
we have that product effectively somewhere, but what effectively happened is we went through well, you might have heard this pandemic, right? And security demand basically went practically to zero, right? Like the bottom fell out of that market. And so we'd actually planned to sort of move out of security anyway because we saw that commoditizing. We thought we had an extra year. We didn't, right? And sort of, but we were moving in the right direction at the time. So what we did was we took all of the different pieces because the biggest problem with shipping, honestly, not that different from AI like a year ago, is a lot of early building blocks needed to get built before you could build anything on top of it, right? So let's say you wanted to build a marketplace or an engagement system, you still needed a really good routing engine that could predict what the route a ship was going to take. You still needed to be able to connect to positioning systems for ships to be able to pull that information in, and you needed a good ports database that was constantly being enriched so you knew where the ports and where the regions were. None of those things are directly related to the service you're offering, right? They're almost like the building blocks you need to have. The same way that you build an AI now, and you also need to figure out how to do prompt templating, testing, and all of these other things. And so we built all of those things from the ground up. And we decided we were just going to take those things and repurpose them for crewing, which became sort of the biggest problem during COVID.
Right. And crewing meaning, let's say you have a vessel, it needs a crew of 10, 15 people. They each need to have certain skill sets, and without certain skill sets, it cannot sail or something like that.
That's exactly it, right? Vessels are usually, and they're not by definition. There's not a lot of room on the vessels, so they're usually understaffed in a certain way. And the way that this works is a bit more comprehensive than the airline industry. The shipping company is responsible for you in a lot of cases from the minute you leave your door at home to when they return you, right? And you're usually doing 3 months on, 3 months off, 6 months on, 6 months off, and you need to get rotated out. and that rotation happens, has to happen like clockwork, but it can't really disrupt the vessel's schedule or cargo or any of those other things. And what happens if you don't do that thing, which is what happened during COVID, is travel lockdown, or countries weren't accepting anyone, so you really couldn't get people off vessels. Is people get tired, above a certain amount of time at sea. All sorts of psychological issues happen, suicide rates skyrocketed, and all of these problems happen, right?
Is the suicide rate for crew high or low, or I know in the airline industry, pilot suicide rates are actually quite high. There's it's
Yeah, that's
actually
a,
a quite
and
significant.
I read something at some point that this was more to do with how you couldn't really seek mental help, or mental health, as a pilot, right? But in the among seafarers, I think it varies really from region to region, to class to class to class. But every indicator shot up during COVID, right? Because people on the shore couldn't get to their jobs, and they really rely on that income. And people on vessels were at some point, like overstaying their contracts by a year and a year and a half, right? And you had all
Oh
sorts
wow.
of problems come up.
So how did you start using AI in your products? Like, what was the first AI product you guys started?
So take you back just a little bit more, right? My original background is in a lot of ways AI and CV and quite a bunch of stuff, right? So I'd always been the person inside the company. And when we went through a deep tech wave here in Singapore, we've been through different AI waves that always resisted having AI inside of your company or your product unless it serves a very clear use case or improves something directly, right? When LLM sort of launched, like I'd been following GPT-2 and GPT-J. There was an there are old subreddits where GPTs talk to each other even way before ChatGPT. And what became very quickly obvious was that this was a revolution in NLP. Like, I was kind of short-sighted at the time, but because for me I was laser focused on the problem of NLP, because most of shipping's data is very, very human, right? It's all sitting in PDFs and emails and all of those things, and that's where your engagements are. That's how you know how your people are doing, how much profit you're making, what's happening to your company. That's all human information in 8,000 formats, because shipping is the original decentralized industry, right? So when the GPT transformer models started coming up, what I saw them as was a way to do better NLP. So that was the first product that we kind of released, right? The first product that we released was a way to pull structured data out of your emails and related to suppliers, right? Because a shipping company, for example, day to day per person might send and receive 100, 300 emails, right? That are relevant to tracking the price of something, purchasing a goods or service, getting like a disbursement accounting form, or all of these different things. And they're just sat in PDFs, and they're sat in PDFs inside of emails, inside of, something else. So that was the first product that we released, is just being able to pull structured information out. We actually went one step further, which is because these things started to become chat models almost as early. We also built effectively an interface that would automate communications. So you could send in information to a shipping company about something, and 99% of the time, the first response from the shipping company is, "You forgot something," right? You didn't include something that we really needed. You're ambiguous about something, and that's a small place where a language model can easily make that decision, even way back with the first version of ChatGPT. And so that was the first product.
So typically something like, you're always supposed to tell us like what time the crew is supposed to unload. Whenever you send us a message, because every single time you have to include that piece of information,
Yeah.
and you just randomly like, hey, and just do this something, and you didn't do that, and they're like immediately like, no, we can't accept anything unless you say like this magic word, right? So and then you have to, and so the LLM could just.
Yeah, and even today, I'm surprised that there's not a ton of people doing that, because I think that's an easy win in a ton of industries, right? Because I spent 3.5 years in insurance and reinsurance, and if I was there, I would be doing exactly that, because they had the exact same problem, right? Either on the human side, when claims come in, when patients send you information, usually your first response is, "Hey, you forgot to include the bill or the document that we need to be able to process it." Or on the other side, for the insurer side, they send you information, and they're always missing information, right?
It's funny because it's a natural language API, right? It's an API between, a human being and an organization. And that API, you need to
Exactly.
have certain requirements, right? And if those requirements are not met, you have to send it back and you have to say, like, look, you didn't meet the requirements of the API. So you need to send me in this input data or else I can't have the work, right?
I mean, that's a really good way to put it. The way that we kind of see it and isolated a few places where, look, for some reason we've taken to putting a lot of processes in place in really large industries to get humans to work like computers, right? So insurance, shipping, quite a bunch of places. There's humans that are just working through checklists and being forced to work in a lot of ways like computers do, right? Practically human APIs, and those are areas where a good chunk of that load could just be taken off their hands, right? And those are also the same people still making the decisions, but they also have to do all this other work.
Yeah, because basically there is in a large company you need to reduce variance, right? And so you need
Yeah.
to make sure that's why you have all these checklists and APIs and et cetera, et cetera. You want to reduce all of that variance to something which is manageable, but you still want like the human touch, which is, hey, something is going wrong. I need
Yeah.
to call it in. You know. So when you deal with okay, so now I've noticed that you have a couple of products. You have a SeaGPT. So what is SeaGPT?
So CGPT ended up becoming more of a catch-all term for the different kinds of AI services that we ended up releasing, right? Because once that was off, once that got off the ground, I think it was the most successful launch we'd done up until that point. Just we just started getting hit with everything that people thought AI could do now or couldn't, and some of them were low-hanging fruit, so we were very happy to pluck them off. Some of them were bigger things that we're only now just getting around to solving. And CGPT ended up becoming a catch-all. We've since then rebranded it to Proteus, as
Which
just
is a copilot, which is kind of a copilot assistant, right? Is that
which
right?
is kind of a co-pilot assistant. We find that interface or that branding makes it a lot easier for people to get an idea of what something does, right? So almost like the iceberg thing, there's quite a bit under the surface that we explicitly do where it's just AI powered processing, right? No human's ever going to interact with that system, but it's just another block in a data processing pipeline. And then there's human facing stuff, and that usually falls into the branding of the co-pilot.
So so let me try to explain Proteus. So Proteus is basically, if you are a crew member on a ship, you get access to it, and you can ask it questions like, "Hey, what is my schedule? Where am I going to? Where am I? What's my next stop, etc." I also have access to manuals for the ship or organize like manuals for where's the deck, what is the where do I find this particular object or something like that. Is that correct?
No, it's the other way around, right? And we need to
Okay,
get better at our messaging.
yeah.
What Proteus does is effectively it's a co-pilot for the vast amount of data that a shipping company has. It's designed for people who sit on the shore, whose job it is to manage these ships, right? And that means that they can quickly pull information out, like hey, I need a crew replacement that has these certifications and these things and these things and these things, right? Or I have a vessel that is calling into this particular port. I need to get all the documentation, all of our history of working with suppliers there because I'm trying to do something specific, right? Or somewhere else, and you go, hey, I
So
need to
so
find
so it's
these
the
flights.
charter, like the person who's chartered the vessel basically, who
That
use it.
it's charterers, ship managers, and we honestly will be here for like 3 hours if I start going into the layers of the shipping industry because there's so many. So it is sometimes charterers, it is sometimes ship managers and ship owners, effectively people with data about a vessel that need to manage that vessel, right? It makes accessing that a lot easier, and of course, once you can access it, you can also use it to do all sorts of planning.
So do you plug in directly into, let's say, your client's system? Like let's say it's a shipping company and they have certain databases, etc. Does Proteus plug in directly into those?
That's exactly it, right? We plug in either to directly to their systems, depending on the size of the company, because shipping is one of those industries, same as insurance, right? That went through one wave of digitization, right? So there's usually either a homegrown or a bought software system that sits in front of that data, like an ERP. And so we usually plug into those ERPs when they exist. When they don't, we plug into Excel sheets.
Right. So basically the user can make a query, and then you have an LLM that processes that query, breaks it down into, hey, which tools do I need to use, or which databases, etc., do I need to call, and then goes off, calls those databases, pulls back the data, formats it into a response for the user, and then returns it for the user.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
And how has been, when did you introduce the product? How has the pickup been? How's the response?
So we introduced the product, I think, 6 to 7 months ago. And honestly, the response has just been very positive and very overwhelming, right? I know shipping companies still move pretty slow for practically any other industry, but this is, we saw sales cycles or just generally uptake cycles go down by massive, massive amounts because I think it resonated the same way that ChatGPT or other AI products are, it captured people's imagination. So usually we'd go in and work with one particular team inside of a shipping company. But in this particular case, everyone wanted to be in that meeting, right? Or we'd go in to have a meeting with the technical team, and some other teams would hear about it, and they'd come to us and go, hey, can we be part of the trial, or can we be part of what you guys are doing? Because I think just that question-answer aspect, or I guess, there's smarter, larger companies doing a lot of marketing for us that is also resonating and connecting in this way. But the response has really just been massive.
I see. And is your client based mostly in Singapore, in Asia, worldwide? Is it, other particular geographic regions that, your clients are? And I know the shipping industry is vast, and everyone sits in different places, but where do the people use the software?
So the people that use the software, it is, worldwide by definition, but there are hubs, right? So the people who use the software usually sit either in Singapore, parts of Europe like Hamburg, or Dubai, and the US, right? Those tend to be your general sort of clustering.
Right. And have you noticed pickup, which is particularly aggressive in one region versus another, or generally everyone's kind of using it, everyone's kind of picking up at the same time?
So everyone is picking it up at the same time. But I will say the different countries and different jurisdictions just have different patterns of how things get taken up. Europe, for example, understandably very concerned about regulation. So those tend to be the teams that we interface with first, right? One of the companies that we work with, for example, the team we speak to sits in the exact same floor as the the compliance officials for the country. So that changes the pattern of how you interact. There are other places that are a little bit more, move fast and break things. Let's put this in the hands of people, and then we'll figure it out. But that it's more of a culture thing.
Interesting. So the one European strategy has been we are going to be the hub for regulation. So everyone has to come to us first. So they actually pulled it off, right? It's so, you have another product called Ocean Oracle, and I think I've seen you kind of like demo some of this. Like you guys basically took kind of schematics of engineering diagrams, and you did like some sophisticated thing, and you made it like queryable using a GPT or something like that. Like how do you what is it? What did you guys?
So that honestly came about as a result of, so we are, in our DNA, at least originally, we're a vertical SaaS company, right? Meaning, we take existing tech in a lot of ways and we figure out how to verticalize it to a specific industry using industry knowledge. That was our primary area. And I guess we're not anymore, but Ocean Oracle was one of those things that started it, right? Effectively, what happened was customers came to us and said, we have PDFs, we have information we'd like to, upload to your AI. They're really valuable, really important. And we said yes, right? Because in some ways, we'd been responding to the standard marketing and we'd been responding to the general perception that AI can do that now, right? Chat with PDF and all that. So we expected there to be either something off the shelf or something that we could work with someone else with the IP, then we could verticalize it, make the adjustments needed for shipping. So we said yes, which was our mistake, but it's also the thing that ended us up in this position. And then they send over the PDFs. And these are, per document, 5,000 to 6,000 pages of incredibly dense schematics and diagrams, right? Some pages you OCR and you get basically blank space, right? Nothing comes out, right? And again, these are really important. And the questions they sent over as, like, can you help figure this out, are not simple questions that, you would find in the document. These are things that would require you to go across the document, right? Like, let's say there's a fire in a specific area. You would first need to figure out that fire would belong to this particular machine, figure out what the evacuation procedures are for that, and something else. And also things you don't want to get things you don't want to get wrong, right? So we were in that dilemma and we decided, hey, we're just going to go ahead and try to solve that. So what we ended up figuring out is there's a bunch of key pieces missing from the AI infrastructure at the time. I think now there's very smart people building it. Is we have no way to visually index information, right? We can index text information with embeddings, sort of, where you can sort of search through them. But if there's visual relationships and information, there's no way to index it so you can find it later. And B, there was no sort of good way to do, cyclic retrieval, which is thinking about the way the humans do it. If I ask you to find information in new text, you almost always will find some things, use those as reference, and look more, right? Until you get to a point where you say, "Hey, I've looked enough," right? So there was no way to do that, and we thought that was the big key to getting more comprehensive retrieval. So that's what we ended up building with Ocean Oracle, right? Is a way to visually index information, and also for an LLM or whatever it is that is part of the chain to go, hey, I'd like to look more, and here's where I look more.
Interesting. So, do you guys use any open, like one of the underlying LLMs that you guys use, like GPT-3, 3.5, 4, Opus, Mistral? Like, what do you guys use on a mix, or like, what are the ones that you work with in production?
So it's definitely just a big mix, right? Because we definitely have, a GPT 3.5, we have 4 Turbo. We also use Claude, Claude Instant way back when that was a thing. Now we're starting to switch to Haiku, sort of modern models. We did try out Gemini for a while, and we consistently keep looking at open source models. And at one point, we had moved some parts of our pipeline to open source models. But I think just the pace of everything moving, today I think it's about 90 to 95% centralized sort of large models. But we expect that's going to change.
I see. What is the process? So I have a bunch of people who are building. I met a bunch of people who are building open source models, right?
Yeah.
And so they would all come and end up pitching to you as the CTO of a company that uses models. Like, what is the thought process that you would have when you evaluate, let's say, a Mistral or someone else who comes into you and says, like, hey, we have this like Mistral large, like, what would you look at that model for it to do for you? What is the process that you would evaluate this model?
That's a really good. That's a really good question. The way that I would put that is, there's your standard sort of graph and your standard sort of spectrum of task complexity of the different things that you need to get it done, and then you've also got the general distribution of is this human facing or not, right? So I think most any model at any size can be fit for purpose as long as it falls in the right part of that spectrum, right? Meaning it can do really simple tasks, but it's either really cheap to run, really small, easily embedded somewhere else, and that works, right? Or it's human facing and it's expensive, but it's fast. Because when it comes to things that face users, you're almost always looking for latency, right? And Mistral's done a wonderful job there. I don't know what kind of black magic they've got going on, but I don't know if anyone's noticed it, but their time to first token is insane. You can throw in practically, like 20,000 tokens into the context window, and you get the first token out almost instantly compared to everything else. So there's a bunch of different things that we use to sort of evaluate that. But I will say for us, the goal with open source models is eventually that we can embed them client side. Like that's the reason we push forward with open source models, especially in enterprise. That has huge implications for privacy and data security, right? When you're doing, and the number of tasks that need plain text sensitive information are still simple enough that we're right at the cusp of open source models being able to do that, right? You don't need very high levels of intelligence to turn something into structured data, right? Or make a transformation or sort of build a query from sensitive data. And so I think the next big jump is going to happen for open source when these models get embedded client side.
Right. So as you said in your case, where a lot of emails, you just need to check that certain things were filled in, and if they're not filled in, just respond. And that's not a particularly very intelligent task that you need a GPT-4 Turbo or whatever.
Exactly.
And it's very sensitive because it's reading your email, right? So you want to be aware of that. So another question: when you have, again, like an open source company like that, like Mistral and whatever, approach you and they have this open source model which they've already published, why would you as an enterprise choose to purchase their services? Like, what kind of services do they offer you that you purchase versus just downloading them out from Unepace? Like, what is it? What are the typical services that you would expect from an open source provider for you to want to purchase some kind of deal with them rather than just downloading them out?
I see what you mean. That changes a fair bit, especially because I don't think a lot of providers have been kind of laggard in providing a suite of services on top, and so then companies like mine end up building those things, right? Because you need them because you've hit production and you absolutely need those things. So then implicitly, the providers are competing with your suite of stuff that you use internally, right? And that might be things like rate limiting, token tracking, usage metrics, just all the quality of life things that exist on top, right? Playgrounds and everything else, right? When they don't exist fast enough, companies end up building it internally. And once you do, when providers come to you, they're effectively competing in some ways for that quality of life layer. But the biggest one, I would say, the biggest reason to use their services or to have them run the model is if they can make use of economies of scale, right? Companies like mine, and even if it's not companies like mine, just much bigger companies included, right? I still think that providers are always still going to be able to optimize, really, really well for, stuffing GPUs with as many tokens as possible and pinning them to zero and sort of optimizing for bandwidth, right? To eventually be able to deliver things, right? Because most workloads, no matter how many users you have, are usually going to be bursty, right? And I think the big difference there in some ways is kind of choosing to use a provider like Vercel or running your own servers. And we actually do both. So we know. And so sometimes you're just saying you don't want to do that DevOps work, especially in the early days.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about Lumentis. So Lumentis was a project I think that you published on GitHub. So it's kind of like more of a personal project. It generates documentation. Right? It generates and you dump in documents in there, and it generates like nice, easy to read, online documents with kind of like et cetera, and sections, and I can click through. Right? And it went viral on Twitter, and on GitHub. And I saw a comment. You just eliminated the entire technical writer's job in a day. Right? So what happened with Lament is like, why did you, how did you come about to think of the project, and when you perform?
Oh man, the Lumentus project effectively came from, and I did not expect that to resonate as much as it did, because it was really trying to solve my specific problem that I had using my specific situation that I had, right? Which is effectively this: we build and launch quite a bunch of things internally, right? And a bunch of things happen internally. There's a bunch of projects going around. There's a lot happening, and what all of those things are missing is documentation, right? And the biggest reason they're missing documentation is the initial step of creating documentation is just a massive piece of work. Someone has to understand everything, go through all of it. But on top of that, they've also got to now build the diagrams and the structure and all of it to make good documentation. Once you have it, keeping it up to date is less work. And I know people might disagree with me on that, but it is less work. And creating that is so much work that it usually goes without it. When it goes without it, what ends up happening when you have people that you need to onboard to that project, or you need to distribute that knowledge internally as a company or to people, is you have, very similar to what we're doing now, is you have meetings about it, right? And so after the sort of fourth meeting where I had to re-explain a project, I went, there's enough information in these two meetings to build good documentation, right? And I also know that having someone on the other side who's constantly asking questions about what doesn't make sense to them, what actually doesn't fit, all of that could be turned into really good documentation, right? Or at least it felt like the content was there. So I threw this thing together like over a night. I honestly didn't expect it to work. I expected it to be kind of a demonstration of the fact that language models could do this at some point in the future. But are not at that point yet, because it's a massive amount of information you're dumping into context, right? But Opus blew me away with how well it actually, Claude 3 Opus blew me away with how well it did on the documentation. I was reading through these and I kept going, well, this is right. I haven't seen a mistake just yet. It's not wrong yet. And then Sonnet blew me away because it could do the same thing, and Haiku at the end really blew me away because it could do the same thing but for less than 10 cents.
Yeah.
So that's the story.
The recall, right? The faithful recall is quite something to see in those models.
Exactly.
Yeah. So yeah. And what what do you think, like, when what has been like the one or two anecdotes that users come back with from using some of the tools that you have put at their disposal using the AI views, like sometimes anecdotes, rather than data, anecdotes are can be interesting or illuminating on and how they actually interact. So have there been any interesting, like, oh, I was in a fire and I looked at it and it helped me out, like that kind of those kind of moments for story?
Oh man, I'm trying to remember stuff that is, and just making sure I sanitize some of the proprietary things in my head. I think one of them effectively that was really interesting is we had a user who came and sort of test the Ocean Oracle product, and I was looking at technical manuals for the kind of technical engineers, and he said it did a great job. Right? He said I asked about 7 questions and it did a great job, and we were like, that's awesome, that's really good, but you seem surprised. And he goes, well, that's because I asked the questions that I usually ask to sort of as part of stumping new engineers because they wouldn't necessarily know it and it's really hard to find, right? And so we've also found this kind of divide between users effectively, where quite a bunch of users, and these are surprisingly in the minority, will be very, very nice to the system, right? They don't really push it. They sort of ask very simple questions. Let's say things you can expect your computer to do already, but take it up half an order of magnitude, right? And then you've got users that start with the most complicated thing they can imagine and then work their way down. But yeah, we've just seen that general spectrum. Uh, I was also talking to a friend of mine the other day about the fact that I think a lot of AI products go into this kind of loop where, and Lamentis is also a good example of where that happened, because I showed it to a bunch of people and a bunch of people used it and they said, this is amazing. But it really doesn't let you update the documentation, right? And I went, yes, but that is another massive open problem, right? And I've been talking to a lot of AI companies. It seems like they all end up in similar loops where, you do something really well, but because it triggers that right part of the uncanny valley or the rest of it in your head, you almost immediately jump to more and more complicated questions, and that starts that loop of, sometimes disappointment.
Yeah, I mean, it's the autopilot versus full self-driving, right? Like,
Exactly.
okay,
Yeah.
you can do cruise control, all right. I wanted to park the car for and you fade hidden, like, no, that's not gonna happen. We're not Finniers.
That's
you
exactly.
know.
I mean, granted, we've tried to stay with our messaging on the cruise control side of things. We're like, look, we want to be delightful cruise control and sort of work up from there.
Right. So I think how important is latency versus accuracy? Like, I mean, do people want, like, is because gimmicky for can be pretty slow, because especially if you're using the API and you don't have a reserve instance, it's fairly, there's a lot of latency there.
So latency and accuracy are like very strongly connected through more ways than I'd initially realized, right? One big one is just UX, right? And the way that people see these systems as intelligent systems. And the reason I say that is because we've now come to realize that for users, if you take longer, they expect you to be better,
Oh, oh
right?
wow.
Because to
Okay.
a user, the system is thinking, right? If you take 8 seconds to come back to a user, they expect a significantly higher quality of answer or service than if you got back to them in 10 milliseconds. Exactly, right? Because we've gotten so close to general intelligence and how humans are. And that intuitively kind of makes sense, right? When you think about it as a user. Because for us, if we can start putting out a token almost immediately, users tend to react very differently. If we make them wait for 20 seconds, they expect the entire thing to be done, and the questions get more and more complex, and you get less buy-in, right? Almost everything we build, it's also just about, I think there's a lot of ways you can also balance latency and accuracy, right? Because there's a lot of things you can do to give users more of an understanding of what's actually happening, right? And I think that matters more than the answer, because the more you involve people in, and you might have seen this in some of the demos for Ocean Oracle or things, is that it takes you through sort of chain of thought. It sort of flips you through a bunch of pages that are currently being looked at. And all of those things help with user buy-in because they feel like they know how the system's thinking, and they do by looking at it, right? So quite a bunch of cases, they're out before the answers even showed up because they got what they were looking for. Or the answer shows up and very, very rarely it's wrong. And when it's wrong, instead of users coming to you being like, hey, you had a system for me and it gave me the wrong answer, they come to us with, hey, it gave me the wrong answer, but I know why, because it was looking at the wrong pages. And that's an understandable mistake because I know that that shows up in those pages. So they're a lot more bought in. They're a lot more willing to work with the system.
There is a paper from Microsoft on the first implementation for clients or GPT-based system, and it has a lot of knowledge there about like all of the weird things that be and it has this thing where they are experienced coders are finding it very difficult because they're like it's non-deterministic, and so it's how do we do continuous integration, right? Because it's non-deterministic. So how did you guys deal with those problems? You must have some test cases on things that it should say or shouldn't say, etc. But then once in a while you have those things. Then how do you deal?
So, I think we have basically two problems effectively, right? One is iteration. You've got a system and you want to make it better or you want to find better ways to do it. And in the world of, deterministic coding and other things, basically look at the problems you add on to code, right? Whereas in the case of prompting and the way you work with models, sometimes you might have to throw the entire thing out and start over and you get a better response, right? Or a new model might require that. So that kind of incremental optimization to the same piece of text, which is, encoding perfectly the right thing to do, may not be the right thing here, right? So we had to put in place just ways of thinking about it that made that difference. Now, the other one is in terms of correcting and sort of fixing things or improving general performance. So we do put in place tests and sort of benchmarks, but we might still be at the stage, or AI might still be at the stage where I think you really can't beat direct human evals. So
Someone just sitting there and asking questions.
Someone just sitting there and asking questions, and someone just actively looking at success and failure cases, right? I think we're too early. I might be wrong on that, but I think we're too early for LLMs to be evaluating themselves and for that to be a viable strategy to take you into production. They might be good classifiers to tell you what stuff you definitely don't have to look at and what stuff you definitely need to look at. But actually reading the responses, actually going through the system, and we've just found so many ways that systems can be better just by doing that.
Actually, just typing out a prompt and putting it in there and seeing what happens, and you're evaluating.
That's exact. I also say that because when this happened among sort of the engineer friends that I knew in my network and sort of inside the company, I also saw this kind of polarizing reaction, right? People split into camps where some people wanted to get away from prompting as quickly as they could, right? It's non-deterministic. It reminded them in some ways. One person actually told me, it's the only reason I'm saying that, of why they got into development in the first place, because it felt like we're, like managing humans again, of saying please and all of these
It felt
different
like
things.
managing humans again. Wow.
Because you don't get deterministic repeatable output, right? You could tip it $20 to get a better answer. And so they were all looking for abstractions and ways to get away from prompting. And then another crowd was immediately in love with it, because of what you could do. So to homogenize things a little bit more, I think forcing people to get really, really comfortable with the prompts and the responses, especially while these models now are still so young and we don't actually even know the proper distribution of how they respond to different things, I think is really valuable, right? So it has that ancillary benefit.
Indeed. What comes next? Because we are in this process where we think we have agentic. A lot of people are working on AI agents this year. We haven't seen. We saw like prototypes last year with like baby AGI and stuff, some stuff like that, but stuff that didn't work, right? So and there's some expectation that we'll have like some kind of working agents sometime this year. And some people are like or loop with the GP key, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
So yeah. So again, like, but what do you think comes next for you guys? As if you have like somewhat of a working 2, 3, 5 step long agent, what do you think happens? Or do you think that's actually hard to use in an enterprise environment because there's still these kind of unknowns on like giving it like some access and you don't know what it's going to do, right? Right access to something you don't know what it's going to do.
Oh man, I'll give you a few different answers to that one, right? Um, the first one effectively is I don't think any sort of arbitrary or model written code execution is going to be good for enterprise in the short term, right? We still haven't begun to think about how we can draw good lines and good controls over LLM written code to make it safe. And arbitrary code execution before LLMs were writing them in an enterprise space was already a no-go, right? We haven't ever built a sandbox that can't be broken out of when it comes to these things. So that immediately makes it a no-go for quite a bunch of different industries. That said, most of our work has focused on, and we're quickly coming to the thesis that the tools are what matters, right? And we've kind of moved down the stack a fair bit, is the agents can be dumber if your tools are better, right? If your designation of the tools, if your description of the tools and the way that you've structured and built them, those are what we found accumulate the most improvements, right? And that can be as simple as something that learns how to call an API, or something that learns how to read a SQL database, or something that generates a query, or any number of these different things, right? So the smarter and better those are, the lower we found the intelligence requirement for agents. And we found that kind of accidentally because we were hoping eventually that we would be able to get to an open source model that could run a proper agent. So we were trying to lower the intelligence requirement ourselves. But we also then realized that if the tools got thicker and better, then the agent the agent needed to be less smart. But if you gave it a smarter agent, now it could do a lot more, right? Or a smarter model on top, now it could do a lot more. And so that has kind of underpinned a lot of the work that we do, right? And a big reason for that is also just having been in production this long and just having had users bring us problems and things they want to do. I think a finite set of tools that keep getting improved, it will still cover about 80 to 90% of use cases, right? We like to think we're diverse. We're not that diverse, right? And then you can have code execution or meta agent prompting or meta prompting for the rest. But these ones, I think having a wonderfully curated, highly optimized set of tools is kind of the solution, right? The Oh no, I was just going to say the analogy that I most recently used is instead of having a big brain 100x CEO and a number of workers, right? I think you can get far better results with a mediocre CEO and 100x people under him, right? Who all really know how to do their jobs, right? And the guy at the top, which is your agent, just needs to largely give out some instructions and check the outputs and sort of manage that.
So there's a Palantir demo from last year where they have this battlefield agent, and the agent is a GPT Neo J, like it's one of those early GPTs, GPT before 3GPT, and it basically just does conversation. All of the tools that go into it though come in through the Palantir system, where every single input and output is totally known, who has access to it, who has the authority to use it. So there's like so much metadata coming in there that Palantir controls. And then the agent just sits around and by just directs traffic. Like, you said this, you have access to these tools. Which one, and that's basically it. The agent really has no way to do anything else. And then they demoed it, calling it a strike, but then it just shows a menu and you click and then you're calling him the strike. Yeah. So
that's exactly it, right? And this is something that I've now become more confident in simply because we've had that history of being able to show that, right? I think Anthropic was recently talking about parallel tool calling in sort of larger numbers of tools. Our early iterations, and we didn't realize it at the time, could very easily do, like 100 tools and 100 parallel tool calls. And that's because none of the tools were very thick sort of API calls. Most of them were calling, intelligent tools and just saying what you wanted.
Right. Right. So, and this is in reference to Anthropic, like in their most recent release of a documentation, they showed a Opus model calling in 100 haiku models, each one doing a call to a rep page, I guess
Yeah,
scraping it or something, bringing it back, parsing it, and then returning, and then so you could get a kind of cable or chart of like a summary of all the data that was on like those 100 pages, something like
exactly. Yeah.
that. Right. That's interesting. It's really like reducing the range of motion, Adam, like the range of motion that the degree of freedom of motion that the agent has,
Yeah.
to something which is acceptable and within that kind of like controlled kind cordoned off like safety area that you can still kind of manage all the variants.
That's a really good way to put it. From my perspective, it also sort of increases the freedom for how much the model can sort of ideate and do things, right? If I give you sort of the three examples, right, of the three major architectures that I see around, the standard way to do tool calling would be you give it sort of a bunch of different tools and say, hey, here's 4 APIs. Each one's got 50 parameters, right? I want you to do this thing, but I want you to write detailed API calls for the 50 parameters. So about 400, 200 parameters, and write that out. I'll execute it for you and I'll give you the response, right? That's one. Ours is somewhere in the middle. It's more of, hey, here's 4 tools for you, right? This particular tool deals with, let's say, crewing data. Here's one that deals with chartering data. Here's one that deals with flights. All I want you to do is basically call this tool and then describe what you want to happen with flights. So you could literally just say, there's no parameters. You literally could just say, hey, I would like to know what red eye flights are, what non-red eye flights exist for the next week to go to Los Angeles. And then that tool will figure it out and go off and figure it out itself, right? Then you've got the sort of new sort of meta prompting one, which is, hey, I have this thing for you. You can do about 4 things, but I want you to write the prompt and then execute that for each of these individual tools from scratch, right? And then if you do a good job, they'll come back and give you a response. So really for us, it's about the intelligence requirement. And the more we can lower that, the more the model has room to really surprise you and sort of build more things.
How many ideas do you prototype, and of which, what is your version rate to production?
That's a really good question. I think the conversion rate would probably be around say 10 to 20%, right? Of the ideas that we prototype. That's simply because of a lack of resources and time, right? And also as a company, it's very different. As an individual, I can work on a number of different things and they're all really fun and they all really help me. As a company, you want to make sure that you're pointed in one direction.
Right on. So, and are there other? So there's definitely a lot of ideas, right? Like because post GPTs, there's a and what do you think is like the gating factor? I mean, like, how would you make a decision between like, hey, this is important enough that we're gonna do it, and it's not worth our time. Like, well,
Uh, I think there's a number of different factors there. One of them is this solving an internal problem? Is this something we can dog food in any sort of way? Because that makes a huge difference, right? You ideally want to be, especially people working in enterprise, working in industries like shipping or insurance or a number of different ones. The holy grail is really a product that is also useful to you, that your team can use, that you can then dog food, right? Because that's a product that can get continuous improvement. So every time we hit on something like that, I'm very, very excited, right? But on top of that, once you've got enough history as a company, you usually will find something, do something, and then you can just look back to see a trail of requests or problems or pain points that trail behind you from the last multiple years of conversations that you've had.
right now. What kind of what two or three numbers you carry in your head that you always kind of like either quote or it's numbers that you define kind of like your business, or what do you think about? Because I carry a bunch of like different stats in my head, but really I just picked so what are those two or three numbers in that you carry about in your English?
Oh man, that's a really good question. Nothing comes to mind right now, and that's because we've just been through going through a bunch of different customers and a bunch of different races, and I guess I just got flushed out. Right? Let me think about that. If I come up with something, I'll come back to you.
Um, what does your typical day look like? Like, what did yesterday look like? Are you woke up and are you working on Singapore hours, U.S. hours? Because you have clients all over the world. How does that work? What does your typical day look like?
So we're based around the Singapore time as a company. So 9 to 5, I am either available or in meetings or working with the team as much as I can, right? That said, usually I'll reserve about 9 to about 1 a.m. for US calls and for working with either investors or customers in that time zone. In between is time that I either spend with my girlfriend, go for a bike ride, or do different things, and then there's sleep needs to fit in there somewhere. But you figure it out.
Um, is your dev team in Singapore or remote, worldwide? Like, how does that work?
Our dev team is so we give people a lot of freedom to be able to travel and sort of move around. Almost no questions asked. So they tend to be in Singapore quite a bit of the time, but people also travel. I think one of our key devs is right now in Brunei, and so people move around a bunch. But usually everyone coalesces around Singapore time.
How big is the firm?
The firm, I think, at the moment is about 8 people. So it's not and that's split down the middle on business and dev.
Right on, right on. Um, and you guys are invested in by Flexport. I think Flexport and I think Instacart as well.
Yeah,
So, do you are they also your customers, or do you work with them, or or are they basically just like you're in shipping, they're in shipping related kind of thing? How do they come about?
I think there were quite a bunch of different things that we were thinking of at the time because Flexport is effectively in more, and of course Flexport's gotten so much bigger. So I might be wrong about these things, but at the time my understanding was that Flexport's far more in the logistics side of things than where we are, right? And those are sort of the yin yang different parts of shipping, right? It's what goes inside the ship, and there's a lot to do with the cargo, right? And there's a lot about how do you keep that ship afloat and the right people on it and sort of get it to the right places, right? So we were sort of different parts of that. I think we did have early conversations about how we could possibly use the information that the other has to better do what we were doing. I don't think anything came out of that because these ended up just being big enough problems to solve on their own.
Indeed. Um, what do you think are the next big things, that you guys are looking towards? Like, is it a product? Is it expansion? Like, what are the next big things?
I think the biggest thing for us would be able to take what we've done in a lot of ways with walking rag or sort of vision rag, and then expand that out to larger data sets, right? Because we're starting to see that place where very high value technical expertise inside of a company can now be baked into systems because they already have the documentation, and that can be very very helpful, right? Especially in shipping, where the biggest problem that the guys were trying to solve when they came to us with the thing that became, walking rag, was they had a lack of technical engineers on board the ship who knew enough about a vessel's systems to be able to solve problems. So they usually had to make ship-to-ship calls or talk around and find the right person, and you may not always have the time or the money or the ability to do that. And these are very highly critical problems because a gas tanker is $220 million and has a ton of very, very intricate systems on board that help it function. Long term, I think we can expand that out to the company. We're really hoping things happen with open source and model execution that make it possible for us to do that client side, because I think that is going to be sort of the next massive jump.
Is that because there is internet access issues on the ships? Because that's one of Starlink's reasons for existing, is because internet access on ships. And I had a friend who was a nuclear submariner, and he's tell me that his boss,
Yeah.
the commander of the ship, would reserve all of the internet time for his own emails. No, no,
Okay.
no one else on the ship had internet access except him because he wanted to like boo his emails. So is
That
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 is
is
that
okay.
is that still a thing? Yeah,
That's really cool. Okay, remind me to either look that up later because I have no idea how submarines get internet. Do they have to surface
yeah, they
or?
do. They serve as in there like something they put something that's
Oh, got
trails
it. They
behind them.
put up a
Yeah,
radio
yeah,
tower.
yeah,
So
yeah, yeah.
it is kind of related to the internet access on a vessel, but that's where the chat interface has been really great, because we've been trying to do that for the last sort of 3 years, is transform some of our services into chat so that they're more easily accessed by people on ships. This was before Starlink. Now I think it's becoming less of an issue because Starlink is making a big difference to these ships. But it's more just around data protection and sort of privacy, right? It's also a compliance question. It's a win-win if you can do it, right? Because it means that far more can be exposed to models because they're running client side. It means that companies like us can sell them far easier to companies because there's a lot fewer hoops to go through, right? Understandably, fewer hoops to go through. And there's a lot more optimization that you can do when you've got client side models running.
Right. And what when you say client side, it would be something that runs on a phone, right? Like ideally, right?
Phone would be wonderful, right? I'm really hoping, and I've got a lot of faith in the web, because a lot of pioneering work has already been done. Now you need the application sort of stability work to happen. Um, the Everyone's got practically the same runtime, through V8 and the browser. WASM is now, WebAssembly is now getting to the right point where you can run these models client side. So the ideal would be a website.
Okay.
In some ways,
So
yes,
on browser basically. So
exactly.
I interviewed the Dinport founder Yasin, and he has this. He split his models into a client side and a server side, and then he does a lot of the computing on the client side so that he doesn't have to pay a lot for GPUs on his side. So
Yeah.
he's as so but he did it for like cost them fascinating
That's the
series.
third win.
Right?
That's the third win. You get that for free. At least in our neck of the woods, where people are usually willing to pay for these things more, it's still a win, right? And you get it for free.
Right on. So having it run in browser, and some of these models could be very simple, just kind of like hi bye kind of like the
Yeah,
initial spark, and then the more complex queries basically being fed into something in the back.
that's exactly it. And it makes a huge but even in the enterprise space, it makes a huge difference, right? One of the earliest things that I did sort of partway through this company was take our routing engine, which needed to run on a cluster in the cloud, and sort of move that client side, right? So that can run in the browser. So once we switched all those routing calculations to client side, that was a big cost saving for what was an even smaller, younger company back then. So it made a big difference.
Right on, right on. Um, so what detail about your product or service you put a lot of time into, which you think that users don't really see, which is sometimes you work on something, like Steve Jobs worked on the insides of the computer, and hardly anyone saw that. Right. So, what do you put a lot of time into that you think users outside don't actually see?
I mean, that's a really good analogy, because we also try to do the equivalent of Steve Jobs and the semi-transparent plastic, which is to try and expose the things we do if we can, even if users may not care as much, because we're proud of them. I think quite a bunch of work internally goes on our side into serializing and deserializing things so users can sort of jump in exactly when they want to, right? That is oftentimes unsung work. And when I say serialization, deserialization, I mean things like being able to save conversation history at the right points, or if someone is in the middle of sending an automated email or receiving one, right? Being able to deal with all of those interstitial states and sort of saving state. Like, I developed a massive amount of respect for all the people that work on those things, because you don't think about it, right? It's the same way that if you play a modern video game, you don't really think about the saving system or the save or load system, and yet it has to save an entire world as it is and then sort of reinstantiate that. And you just kind of expect that to be the norm. But once you've got that, we build a lot of really social functionality into our systems. And those, because the quality of them is so high outside of enterprise in sort of the consumer app space, I don't think users necessarily notice how much work goes into it in an enterprise space, because you're even more bound by privacy and you're even more bound by regulations.
So, what do you mean by social functionality?
So the goal that we've always had is for users to be able to do something and then pass that on to a teammate and go, "This is where I was, right? Maybe you can pick up." And I'm not saying we've gotten to that goal completely yet, but even something as simple as being able to share part of the work that you're doing with someone else, right? Or having a share feature or an email feature where they can jump right into where you were. that is, orders of magnitude more complicated in enterprise, right? Because access control and permissions and all of these different layers are far more thicker in enterprise.
Is that person allowed to know, right?
Exactly.
Like
And what are
if
they
the
allowed to know? For how long?
yeah, like maybe the captain is not allowed to know what's the pricing of the cargo or whatever. Or
Exactly, right?
I randomly read a shipping manual where they said one of the big problems of shipping was pilferage, especially if you had alcohol. If you're carrying alcohol, you could expect to see some of it go missing every single time. So
Yeah.
and so one of the big deals is making sure the alcohol or cigarettes or other contraband or uncontraband like stuff you're legitimately shipping isn't like lost, or just
Man, and
disappears or whatever.
that happens on the human side of things, but also on the company side of things. Shipping is this massive web of thousands of companies cooperating with each other, right? Travel agents, port agents, charterers, owners, managers, all of these different people. And so it's amazing that the system really works, because there's just so many lines. It's a graph, right? It's not even a tree, it's a graph. um, but that also means that there's always trust issues. It definitely does happen, even at the company level, and not just at the individuals.
Indeed, trust issues, and which is a good segue to um, how do users gain trust in using like systems like Ocean Oracle or Proteus? Like, do you notice a process where they start off with kind of like initial queries and then they go on more sophisticated ones, and if there's a single mistake, some people are like, I'm gonna use it. It gave me a wrong answer. Like, what is that trust building process look?
So that's really interesting, right? I'm also going to use it as an excuse to just talk about the pathway that I've seen users kind of take through these systems. Um, One of them, and this is really interesting to me, and is just that most initial questions tend to be meta questions about how to use the system, which, if you go back through the AI systems that you've used or the products that you've used, most of them are unprepared to answer, right? Like, let's say I give you a copilot, or I give you an AI system that is meant to be able to do something. Most users' first question to that system is, hey, how do I use you? Right? Or what kind of documents do you have access to? Right? And we've all done that, right? So that almost always tends to be the first question, as opposed to, even with question suggestions, a question that is the task that the system's trying to do. So oftentimes that's where we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that the system or some subsystem that activates can really like take you through the onboarding or sort of walk you through questions about these things. But otherwise, once people are in, I think a lot of them go down or go up, right? They start simple and then sort of ramp up, or they start complicated, hit something that's far too complex to answer, and then sort of ramp down and sort of find something a bit easier.
How does that change after they've been using the system for like a few weeks or whatever? Like, do they kind of settle into like a pattern? Like, this is like the six things that we use iPhones and end up with like 5 apps being 99% of usage. So is that something that happens in on a GPT like systems? Like, people tend to default to like 5 or 6 things that they always regularly use it for, patterns of questions, and that's it kind of, or how does that work?
I think it definitely does, right? And that is something that I'm actively trying to solve, because that's a problem, right? You want to encourage exploration. You want people to sort of really discover all the different questions and sort of areas. But what you have, and I say I'm trying to solve it, but I'm guilty of it as well as a user, is you'll have like a short period of very excited exploration, right? And then usually hit some point of disappointment or disillusionment, and then you'll sort of circle back. And the few things that work really well become part of your patterns, and then you effectively stop exploring after that, right? And we saw the exact same thing happen with Google Assistant and Siri and all of these other ones, right? I sort of smart homed a long time ago and sort of switched to Google Assistant. We went through that exploration phase. Oh, hey, can you do this thing? Can you do that thing? Within about a week, we just settled down to using it for alarms. It turned lights on and off, and that was it, right? And so for that pattern, you will consistently activate it. And occasionally it's going to pipe up with, hey, I can do this thing now, but no, you don't trust it anymore. You just use it as a hands-free. You basically use it as a hands-free switch, and you end up there. But that's what I'm also trying to figure out how to avoid with chat interfaces, because their biggest strength is also their Achilles heel, is that the text input is too broad, right? It's really, really broad. You literally can do anything with a text input and could describe almost any kind of task and sort of problem. So how do you give users some kind of control surface to work up and down so they know where the limitations of the system are, where they can experiment more? Still an open problem.
Indeed. One of the many in AI. So I think, thank you, Hrishi. And I think you're one of the very few people who have actually deployed in production, deployed GPT-like system in like a critical area in production, because there's a lot of people in demo stage. There's actually very, very few in production. Most people are still struggling to put stuff in production. And I think you face all of the issues with with the fact smart matching, and you implement a grag, obviously. So because the amount of knowledge that the system has is just not specific enough for what you want to do. So
I mean, I've always had like an engineer's perspective, right? Even though I've done some research, because my dad was an engineer the same way. So you look at how you can get something to work, and that's what you care about, right? And sometimes that means shimmying something up with a piece of wood so that it stays level. Even if that's not the right way to build it, you get things into production.
Indeed. Okay, thank you, Hrishi. Emergent behavior is a part of the Turpentine network. For our full newsletter, visit emergentbehavior.co. For more Turpentine podcasts and sponsorship inquiries, visit turpentine.co